this to as a key into our database and use it to get the user's data back. And this is now exactly what I will do. So in my application, now when I've got this information, I can use that to establish a session with this user, and then I can decide that my application now trusts that this user has this identifier, this subject ID with Google. Let's look at another example. Let's do the login with Microsoft or with Active Directory. So in this case, I will still get the automatic verification because the user was already logged in. Actually, I should go back here and look at this again. So in the case of Active Directory, I specify a different login provider that I go to. So in the first case, Leo was played by Google. In this case, Leo is played by Microsoft. And I get a different client ID. If you notice back when I authenticated with Google, the client ID was actually quite long and contained the name of my app. But in the case of Microsoft, I have a UUID as the client ID. And just like in the case of Google, I tell Microsoft to go or to redirect the user back to my application when it's done. Here I'm redirected back to the application. Let's take a closer look at this because it went past pretty fast the previous time. So this is the URL that Microsoft redirects me back to when the user is authenticated. The most important bit of this URL is the code. And the code was symbolized by this little red token here in the little theater. And the code is a one-time exchange. It's just between the backend of the app and the login provider. And in addition to that, the login provider will now communicate on the backend. The app will communicate on the backend to the login provider. This is when Anne was standing over here and talk to Leo over here. And in addition to the code, she also sends her secret, which was the flower pot in the show, this thing here, over here. And back from Microsoft, you can probably see that this that the token response is somewhat differently structured. But it has the same ID token, and the ID token still starts with AYJ0. So this looks like it is the same kind of ID token. So I can take the ID token, I can take it to jot.io, and I can decode it. And like before, I can see this has audience. It has another string here, which is called issue, which we'll get back to. It also tells me that the user was authenticated with PWD, and what do you think MFA stands for? Well, MFA is multi-factor authentication. So that is the fact that I signed in on my phone, clicking accept on the phone. That is represented by the MFA claim. So all of these properties in the JSON document are called claims. It also claims that my given name is Johannes and my family name is Brodwall, and that my preferred name is Brodwall Johannes. And this is because Soprasteria is a French company, so French people like to have the last name before the first name. And it also gives my email here. So the same question as with Google. Can you trust that this user is Brodwall Johannes? Well, that depends, because the user, me in this case, authenticated with the organization identity in their work account. So I authenticated with Soprasteria's identity provider. And the identity provider of Soprasteria, it is given a unique issuer. This number here, ABA8BA7AF7D, and so on, this is the tenant ID of Soprasteria in Active Directory. It is repeated down here as TID, or tenant ID. And if in my database I know which tenant ID Soprasteria has, and I know I trust Soprasteria as a company, then I can be pretty sure that this is the correct name and email address of that user. At least I am as sure as Soprasteria is when they pay my paycheck. So that is, for most users, pretty sufficient. And getting back to the app, I can then establish a session here, and this session is then johannes.brodwall@soprasteria.com. One thing that is particularly interesting about Active Directory is that this is what's called a multi-tenant application, which I hinted at earlier. The tenant in this case that the user logged in with is Soprasteria. But this app accepts tenants from any organizations or users from any organizations. And in order to illustrate that, I have created my own Active Directory, which is called the 100-Acre Wood. And in the 100-Acre Wood, I have here or rather, in my app, in order to specify that I want a user from the 100-Acre Wood to log in, I have added an additional HTTP query parameter to the login or the authorization URL. In this case, I say the domain hint is the 100acrewood.onmicrosoft.com. So this means that Microsoft will prefer to get logins from this Active Directory. And what you can see here is that I've actually, in this Active Directory, I've set up my own little splash screen with login, with a nice picture from the 100-Acre Wood. And it here lets me sign in. And I will have to then sign in with a 100-Acre Wood user. So let's sign with the rabbit. Sign in with the rabbit at the 100-Acre Wood. And when you're playing with login providers, having a password minder like LastPass is essential. So in this case, I'm having unique passwords for all my test users, and I have no way of remembering them. All right, so I'm logging in with the rabbit at the 100-Acre Wood, and the rabbit is a little bit security conscious. So I actually got an SMS on my phone with a security code for the rabbit. And let's see if I can find the SMS again. 229418, that was the one-time code. And now I'm returned back to my app. So just like before, I have the I get returned with the code in the URL. It's up here. And just like before, I'm going to do a post request. So this is in our example. This is when Anne speaks directly with Leonardo. She sends her the code she received. She sends the secret that she has, and she gets back a ID token. So if we look at this ID token here, we can see that this is this is similar to the one I got from Soprasteria, but the number of the tenant in the issue is different. This is now 9F193 and so on. So this is a different tenant. And here we can see the same tenant ID repeated. That tenant is the 100acrewood.onmicrosoft.com. We can also see that the rabbit authenticated with multi-factor authentication. But here is something that's interesting that we didn't see before. the rabbit has a role, and this role is terrific. Where did that come from? Would you like to know? We are going to look at that in a moment, as soon as I make sure I have set up the backend correctly. So we get into the 100-acre wood, and we now have 3 login sessions. We have the Gmail, my Soprasteria, and the login of the rabbit in the 100-acre wood. And I told you I was going to, or I told you rather, that the rabbit, here are all of the details. So I've repeated the ID token in my demo app here. So the rabbit has this role saying that they are terrific. That's good. How did they get that role? And this might be a more interesting question than you might realize at first, because the app that I've created, this app here, does not have anything to do with the 100-acre wood. It was created as an app for which lives in the Soprasteria Active Directory. And what's important to realize in that case is that I don't have any special roles in Soprasteria, and that means that if you have a Active Directory that you're using in your organization, then that Active Directory is probably available for you to create your own apps in that. So how did this app end up authenticating a user in a different Active Directory, the rabbit, as terrific? In order to answer that, we are going to try and log in again in the Active Directory. But as you can see, when I log in the Active Directory that I've already logged in, it already suggests that I log in with a rabbit. So let's try another one. So in this case, I went to another popular Norwegian children's story, but I can here decide to use an email address that doesn't belong to the email, and then it redirects me to the correct login screen for the organization I actually enter the email for. So now I will log in as Winnie the Pooh in the 100-acre wood. And logging in as Winnie the Pooh, well, first you might have noticed that I did not receive an SMS this time. So the setup that some users require an SMS is done, obviously, on the Active Directory where those users live, not on the Active Directory that hosts the application. And if you look at Winnie the Pooh, you can see, I could have looked at this in the other sense as well, but you can see here, this is Winnie, last name Pooh, and he uses only password to authenticate, and he doesn't have any roles. And at this point in time, it's worth taking a look at the Azure Portal to see how is this actually configured. And I hope that many of you are familiar with, have been into the Azure Portal. I'm not going to give you a tour of that, but what you might not realize is that if you are in your own organization, so here I am in Soprasteria, I have available here Active Directory. This is Soprasteria's Active Directory. And I don't need to have any administrative roles in our Active Directory to be able to do this and see this. This is something that's available to all users. And what you can see here is that I've created here the app that I'm using now to demonstrate this. So here I created this app, and when I created this app, I set up here that this is a app where users with any organizational directory can use this app. So that's how the 100-acre wood was able to authenticate with this app. So let's change Active Directory. Let's look at 100-acre wood. So when I'm in the 100-acre wood, I don't have the app under app registrations, or I have another app, but this is not a part of the demo. But I do have the app under what's called the enterprise applications. And this is the view of an application from the using organization. So what we saw earlier was from the publishing organization. This is from the user organization. And in this case, you can see I've used this example previously in the Java user group, and now it's in the NDC. And in the and this application here, it has the same application ID that you will find in the audience claim here. That's how I know it's the same application. And this application has user and group access. So you can see here that Winnie the Pooh is there. You can see that the rabbit is there. And you can see the Piglet and Christopher Robin. They're, all of those are users that can use or have used this application. But there is also a group that has access to this application. This is a group called Expedition. And in this case, I'm saying members of the Expedition group gets the terrific role. What you can see here is that in the Expedition group, Rabbit, Christopher Robin, and Piglet are members, but not Winnie. So maybe we should just add Winnie. And what is easy to miss, but very important here, is that this administration uses the groups in the client Active Directory. They use the groups that are already set up in the 100-acre wood, even though the application is published from Sopra Steria. And this means that with Active Directory multi-tenant identification, you can use the existing structure of a organization to decide what roles the users have. So going back here, we can also see that in this case here, we can add a user. So we could also have added Winnie directly, and we could have given him a limited, a normal, or terrific role. So in this case, we don't need to do that because we already added him to the Expedition group. So let's take a look now. So I will use the same trick, logging into a different Active Directory, changing the user to Winnie. Oops. Winner. So we change the user to Winnie. And we enter the password. Did you see something different? I was not asked for this two-factor authentication the previous time. So the two-factor authentication is required due to the terrific role, or maybe due to the Expedition group membership. You might wonder about which one it is. I'll leave that as an exercise for you to find out afterwards. All right. So who believes now that Winnie the Pooh has become terrific? Let's take a look. I think I didn't do that correctly. So now Winnie the Pooh is terrific, and he also authenticated with multi-factor authentication. And now I have even more users with the same identity here. So I will try and round up a little bit of the identity providers, and then I will review a little bit of what we've seen, and then I will open for questions and answers. So if you have any questions or things you would like me to cover, you might want to put them already now in the chat. Okay, the last identity provider that I want to show is ID Portal, the ID gate for the Norwegian government sector. And the first thing you can notice here is that I'm using exactly the same kind of request to authenticate with ID Portal as I used for Google and as I used for Microsoft. The only difference is that the URL I redirect the user to is different, the client ID is different, and the rest is pretty much the same. And if you are Norwegian, you have probably gone through this sort of login here with the Norwegian, I'll use this one, the Norwegian bank ID system to authenticate to your user. And for those that think that I cannot possibly be as young as this seems, we'll get a little bit back to that. Okay, so now after I authenticated myself with a national identifier, a one-time password, and a password, I I got a redirect back to my application with a code. And this code, represented by the little red Lego piece. So for the Danes here, I added one Lego piece so that you would be feeling almost left out, but not totally. And so I got a code back. I have my client ID, I have my secret, and I get the access token and the ID token here. So here is the ID token. We can look at this similarly, and what you will see here is it's the same structure with a header, a payload, and a signature. And the header and the payload have base64 encoded JSON documents, and the JSON documents contains the subject. It tells me that the user was authenticated with bank ID, so that's useful. It also tells me that the authentication class, the level, is level 4, which in this case means that the user has at some point in time verified their identity with a passport or similar in a bank or a similar location. So we have a pretty high level of trust in this user. And the most critical information here is the national identifier number, or in this case, it's called the PID, the person identifier. And in Norwegian standards, these start with the birth date of the user. And I'm not this young. This is a test user that I've memorized in order to be able to test this out frequently. This tells me at least what the personal identifier is of that user. And the same question as before, can I trust this information? Can I trust my user now? Well, I can be pretty sure that that user has the identity of the, or has this national identity number, but I cannot know much about that person. This person, for all I know, could be somebody in jail right now. This could be a crook, because in Norway, luckily, we have a society where even criminals are allowed to use online banking and online governmental services. So everybody, whether they are trustworthy or not, have a national identifier. So I need to make sure that this identifier actually maps to something real. So that means that I can probably safely show the health records of this person to that person. But I cannot use this to decide that I trust this user is a honest person or has good intentions. And knowing what to trust about the user is one of the most essential questions when you are doing OpenID Connect, or when you're doing any kind of identity management. And if I now, so one thing that's kind of interesting with ID-porten is that it has this expires in claim here on the token response. So this tells me that if I press create session, my app rejects this session because the JOT has actually expired now. We can see this here, that this JOT says expire time, which is 11:00, and I was yapping on for so long that the token actually expired before I authenticated the user. Now, that doesn't mean that you cannot keep the user logged in for longer. It just means that this particular document, the identity document, which is represented by this little thing in my play, that the identity document is only valid for 2 minutes. And interestingly enough, the single sign-on session at ID-porten is valid for, I think, 1 hour. So I do get automatically signed in with the user that I had before. I just had to fetch the ID token all over again. And here you can see the personal identifier of that user. So let me summarize all of the things that you see here. So first I logged in with Google, and you could see how I create the authentication URL. I redirect the user, and I get back a code, and I use that code plus the client secret to get a identity document. And that identity document tells me something about the identity of the user. In case of Google, the good thing about Google is that anybody can sign up for a Google account. So you can use this to authenticate any user. So it's great for a business to business, it's great for a business to consumer kind of scenario. It is very good to have to log into your shopping cart or your personal profile or something like that on a consumer website. However, I don't really know much about the identity of the user. I know what name they prefer to be called, and I know the email address that they controlled, that they controlled on one time, but I don't know if that name is truly their own name. Second, I used Microsoft, and I used an app that I had registered in my organization's account, my organization's Active Directory, and so I could log in with Johannes Brodwall at soprastera.com. And this is very good for business-to-business sort of scenarios, because in that case, I could use not only my own organization, but also another organization like the 100 Acre Wood to control access to the application. This is called a multi-tenant application because each of the organizations that log in is a separate domain or a separate tenant where they can control the data in that domain. But you don't want people in the 100 Acre Wood to be able to access data in Soprasteria, because the administrator of the 100 Acre Wood controls all of the roles and all of the accesses of these users. The question, there was a question about this which asked what is the user identifier in the Microsoft token. So in the Microsoft token here, let's see, here we have my Soprasteria ID token, and in this token I have this UPN and unique name, and those are the ones that I use to illustrate or to fixate the user. I think they're just aliases. And just like with Google, the subject ID is the same every time, so you can also use the subject ID as the ID of this user. So we can use Google for consumer applications. We can use Microsoft or Active Directory for business applications. And then finally, I showed using ID-porten, and many countries have similar systems with national identifier, and that's used for citizens. So in Norway, the standards for IT in the governmental sector says that all governmental software or web solutions should use ID-porten. So this really should be used all over the place. And the advantage is, of course, that you now have an identity that is confirmed by the government or the society. In this case, it's actually the bank that confirms the identity of the user. The disadvantage is that you don't necessarily know anything more about the user, and additionally, with ID-porten specifically, it is only supposed to be used for government sector applications. So if you don't have a government sector application, you cannot use it. However, the bank ID, which is the identity provider inside of ID-porten, can be used by quite a bit more of organizations, and there are similar schemes that can be used in addition. So, each of these scenarios, the consumer scenario, the business-to-business scenario, and the citizen scenario, have different best solutions for how to get your identity provider. And one thing that is great about OpenID Connect, and one thing that is great about what ID-porten is doing on OpenID Connect, is that this is a standard and it works quite well as a standard. So when I developed this application, I developed it first to use Google as a login provider. And then the only thing that I changed in order for it to be usable with the other login providers was the URLs, the client IDs, and the client secrets. In the case of Microsoft, I find the client ID. Sorry, that was the wrong organization. I find the client ID and the client secret in my application registration. So this is how I authenticated my user. This is how I got the information about my user here. So I got the client secret over here. In the case of Google, so I will have to use a already logged in web browser to show that. In case of Google, I have I registered in the Google Developer Console, and here you can see the client ID and the client secret in clear text. So apparently Google has a little bit different a threat model around the client secret. In the case of ID-porten, you can actually now administer, if you have a government application, you can administer your services directly. And you can see here, I get the client ID, and I can also register the application on the government portal. So my recommendation when you want to make an app that works with ID-porten is to make an app that works with Google and then exchange the URLs so that it works with the authentication URLs, the client ID, and the client secret of ID-porten. And that is actually how I created this app right here. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. I think we can, I think you have the possibility of raising your hand if you want to ask a question using audio. If you look at the participant panel in WebEx, you can see that I'm raising and lowering my hand now. So if you want to ask a question in WebEx, you can do that either by raising your hand or typing in a question in the chat. I'll also look for questions in the conference room Slack. And while I wait to see if there are any questions, I guess we should thank the participants of the little play. Normally on a physical conference, I like to get people from the audience who play the part of of the user, the app, and the login provider. But in this case, I couldn't invite you guys to come on, so I would have to do with the next best, which would be Lego. But I tried it out with Legos, and my hands really covered all of the Lego, so it was impossible to see anything. So instead, I borrowed my kids' Playmobil, and that's why we got those. So thank you to Ursula, Anne, and Leonardo for being very sporty and helping out with the demonstration. And I have a question here. Yes, a very good question, which is that the response, which is the content of the ID token, varies with the identity provider, and that is correct. And there are some things that are universal, and there are some things that vary. So I'll increase the font a little bit so that it comes better through the presentation or through the video. This is the ID token from Google. And each of the properties in the JSON document, they are called claims. And some claims are standard claims and some claims are custom claims. The is or issuer claim is a standard claim. It tells you who issued this. In this case, it's Google. In the case of Microsoft, it is the tenant that issued it. This looks a little bit different if it's not a multi-tenant, but a single-tenant application. In the case of ID-porten, it is the URL that I use to authenticate it. And interestingly, with ID-porten, this is a test version of ID-porten, which is why I could use a test user. And you would not want to accept this particular issuer in a production application, because that would be a forged identity provider. Second, we have the this HTTP, which I never use, but the audience, that is, who is this ID token issued to? This is my app ID, and you should verify that it is actually your app ID, so that if you're receiving an identity token, that you can then take that identity token and pass it to another app and try and authenticate yourself as that user. So it's very important to check the audience claim if you are receiving an identity an identity token directly from the user. In this case, we got the identity token directly through our through the backend between our app and our login provider. So we don't actually need to verify that. The sub or the subject ID is also universal, and that is a unique identifier per user, per application, possibly. That depends on the login provider. So it might, depending on the setup, you might, two different apps might get the same or might get a different subject ID for the same user, but each app will always get the same ID for the same user. And this is the issued time, and this is the expired time. Those are also standard. The rest of what you see here is non-standard, and they vary. So Google uses email, given name, family name, and name. Microsoft can be set up a little bit different depending on the Active Directory setup. They use family name, given name, and name, and they put the email as unique name or UPN in both, actually. The AMR, or the authentication method, is also standard, but I don't think the contents of it are standard. And the role is also specific to Microsoft. And in the case of the ID-porten, the most important claim here is the PID, and that is also non-standard. So when you're integrating with different identity providers, you need to know what claims you can get from those identity providers. Thank you to Torleif for that question. It gave me a chance to go into something that I really wish I'd covered in the first place. Thank you. Praful Kumar Burde asks if there's any frameworks I would recommend for implementing OpenID Connect in a new application. What I actually recommend is that you implement it at least as a proof of concept manually yourself, generating the URLs and handling the token exchange, because it gives you a lot of insight and it is less code than you want to. Other than that, the most popular frameworks work reasonably well. So the frameworks that are implemented are good to use, but I do recommend doing a proof of concept more on the metal to understand what's going on, because any framework that I've used will actually fail in some situations, and knowing what goes on under the hood is extremely important. Geir Martvedt asks, how do I register to get a dev user for ID-porten, and how do you get a test user for it? So I showed this selvbetjening samarbeid portal. So you can register in the, if you have a login in the samarbeidsportalen at Difi, you can register your own test users there, or excuse me, your own test applications there. And the test users are, there's a set of standard test users that can be reused on all applications. So I recommend just sending an email to ID-porten@difi.no, and they're extremely service-minded and capable people, and they will help you get it set up. And if you don't have enough test users, or if you want the test user to test out my demo application, you can just message me and I'll send you a list of test users. And Lucas asks if the claim is just a fancy name for the property of the token payload. That is correct. So that is, a claim is any property in the payload part of the ID token. That's just another name for the same thing. Danielle asks on Slack, it should be noted, or notice on Slack, it should be noted that the claims of the identity token and access token can be normalized for your app using claims transformation, where you take what's coming in to ensure your app always works with the same set of claims. And this is something that if you're using multiple identity providers, you have to either do that in code or do it with some sort of transformation. So you want to normalize that, but normalization can only go so far. Of course, you can normalize the difference between UPN and email, between Gmail and Active Directory, but you cannot normalize the fact that the ID-porten identity provider uses a number instead of a email address. And you also have to be very aware that it's easier to fake a email address on Google than it is to fake the same email address, or it's easier to lose control of an email address on Google than it is to lose control of the same email address on Active Directory. So not only the claim itself, but where it comes from might matter. But beyond that, yes, you normally want to normalize when you have multiple login providers. I think this is all the time we got for the talk. I'll be hanging around in the conference room and the hallway track at Slack, so just at me. And if you're not aware already, in the next time slot, there is another talk on OpenID Connect, which is in room 3. by Dominic, OpenID Connect and OAuth 2 security best practices. So I hope that this talk gave you the overview and the intro to understand the technology, and then to see how to use it well and to use it better. Please see Dominic's talk. Sorry, we have one question from, let's see, from an attendee. And I cannot wait, maybe I can. I can argue I cannot unmute you, so unless Sigurd unmutes you now, you'll have to do the question using chat or on Slack. Thank you so much for attending the talk. I hope you realize that OpenID Connect can be used in your app and how to get started. And if you didn't know it already, I hope you realize now that if you are in an organization that uses Active Directory, that you can actually use that Active Directory to create apps for your colleagues today without asking anyone for special permission. And that is a great thing. It's great to see the standard work so well. Now I will enjoy my coffee and the rest of the conference, and thank you all.